Hi everyone. So I want to talk about something I've been thinking about for the last decade or so, which is a question about why we spend so much time doing certain things and why other things only capture us very briefly. There are a lot of experiences that we spend a couple of minutes on, but there aren't many that capture us for hours, weeks, months, years. And I think one of the main drivers of these kinds of engagement, these long-term forms of engagement, is this the right? Yep, is curiosity. So curiosity drives a lot of behavior that's wise and unwise. Here's a good example of someone who's curious about something they shouldn't be curious about. And this engages us in ways that we don't always predict, and to an extent that is hard to predict sometimes. So I want to talk about three forms or flavors of curiosity and to explain why I think they drive so much of what's big in business today, and why some experiences capture us for such a long time while others leave us cold pretty quickly. So I call this the curiosity engine, and I'll talk about three components. The first one is a traditional, fairly old school component, which is the cliffhanger, which is obviously a device that has had a long-standing role in storytelling. So the basic storytelling path or arc is you tell people half the story, they wait for the other half, you string them along for a while, and eventually you give them the punchline. And that process of being told half a story is very powerful. It engages you. Humans hate to have half a story. They hate having an open loop they haven't closed. And so cliffhangers are a very powerful device. Now, I can show you an example of this that I think makes this case very well across many decades. This is one of the original uses of the term cliffhanger, the original version of The Italian Job, a movie that's now almost 50 years old. You may or may not know about the movie and about the plot line, but the basic idea is there are some bank robbers and they steal a lot of gold, and they drive a getaway bus that you can see here, and the getaway bus careens off the road and it's perched on the edge of a cliff. Literally, it's hanging over a cliff. And what happens in the last scene of the film is something that people have been discussing ever since for 50 years. And what happens is the bus goes over the edge of the cliff, it's teetering on the edge, the gold is at the far end of the bus that's teetering, and the bank robbers who are trying to recapture the gold are at the other end of the bus. Now they can all jump off the bus and the bus falls to the bottom of the cliff and they lose the gold, or they can try and work out a way to do both, to survive but also get hold of the gold. And the very last scene is the actor Michael Caine on the ground reaching for the gold, and he turns to the other guys and he says, "Hang on lads, I've got a great idea." And then it cuts to black. That is the ultimate cliffhanger. That cliffhanger has stood for 50 years. Now, about 10 years ago, the Royal Society of Chemistry decided that it would offer up a prize for anyone who could prove a way with science that the bank robbers could access that gold. They could get hold of that gold and also survive this cliffhanger. The point I want to make, though, is no one would be talking about this issue to the extent they are if the cliffhanger had been resolved. The way you keep people on the leash to keep them interested is to introduce the cliffhanger and never actually resolve it. And so people spoke about this for decades and decades. There are bulletin boards where people have talked about how much they either love or hate the ending. There is no way this film would have the same attention had they resolved that cliffhanger. That's a very powerful part of what makes cliffhangers so enticing and why we spend so much time focused on them. And this applies to more recent phenomena as well. So Reed Hastings at Netflix was asked a question, who is your major competition? Which is an interesting question. I ask my MBA students that question all the time. Who is the major competition for Netflix? And I love his answer because none of my students ever say this. He said, when you watch a show from Netflix and you get addicted, you stay up late at night. Really, our major competition is sleep. Which is a tough competitor because sleep will always ultimately, eventually, and most people win out. It's a tough thing to compete against. So the big question is, how do you beat sleep? It turns out if you can weaponize cliffhangers, you can start to do that. People who watch a lot of Netflix sleep a lot less. And a lot of this is driven by something that's happened more recently over the last few years in business, which is the eradication of so-called stopping cues. So a stopping cue is a moment when you're interacting with an experience that suggests perhaps it's time to move on to the next thing. And they were everywhere in the 20th century. So you would read a magazine, you'd get to the end of the magazine, or you'd get to the end of an article, and you had the choice at that moment, a very explicit choice, of whether to read the next article or to move on to something completely different. That was true of TV shows as well, traditionally. You'd watch an episode in a TV show, you'd have to wait a week for the next episode to arrive, and so there was a very natural stopping cue, a natural break in the experience. It's a really good way to make sure you don't spend too much time doing any one thing, is to have these natural stopping cues built into the experience. And they were everywhere in the 20th century. Now, you've heard about voice technology. Voice is largely about eradicating stopping cues. There is something so incredibly natural about speaking that there are no natural barriers that rise up out of the experience of just telling a device what you'd like it to do. And that's really smart. It makes things easier, more engaging, and you're less likely to move on to something else, to be distracted. This is also true about Netflix. So Netflix made a very smart decision a few years ago, which was to introduce post-play. So you get to the end of one episode, and the next episode, by default, queues up about 15 seconds later and starts playing. And that's where the term binge viewing or binge watching comes from. That wasn't a thing before now. No one used that term. It was the word of the year about 5 years ago. And that's because this is a new phenomenon. This is built into the eradication of stopping cues. And why this is so powerful is because almost all the shows that you're consuming on Netflix have a cliffhanger, and you want to know what the answer is. And if it's waiting for you there, if all 13 or 22 episodes are available and they naturally play one after the other, you're just going to sit there and the default will win out. You'll end up just continuing to watch. The reason this matters so much from an economic perspective is that when you're trying to work out whether a show will be renewed for a new season, so they produce the first season, the question is, should we fund them for a second season? Should there be production budgets set aside for the next season? One of the big metrics is, do 70% of the people who watch the pilot watch all the way through to the end? Do they watch all 13 episodes or 22 episodes? And if they do, that's a sign that this is an engaging show. They're likely to come back and watch season 2. This show is likely to be renewed for a new season. So here's the thing. Netflix released data showing that with the introduction of post-play, it takes this many episodes. If you watch this many episodes, 75% of viewers or 70% of viewers or more will watch through to the end of the season, which is, again, 13 or 22 episodes. It only takes 2 or 3 episodes before you are hooked to the point where you will watch the remaining 11 or 20. Which is why you just get people on Netflix, they watch with post-play, they see a couple of episodes, there's a very good chance they're going to go through to the end of the season. It's a very powerful device, and this all relies on a cliffhanger with the added removal of stopping cues that encourages people to keep watching. Now, this isn't just about storytelling and storytelling arcs, it's also very much about the physical world and about design. This is a page from Imager, this image collection website. This is one of the pages called Mildly Infuriating. And if you look closely at these images, they are all mildly infuriating. So, for example, the one in the center here is someone who's parked their car diagonally across effectively 2 parking spaces and a strip in the middle that separates them. They parked in the one area that was not actually a parking space, rendering the 2 parking spots unusable. So this, to many people, is mildly infuriating. But I want to give you a sense of how we naturally like to fill in the gaps when we have a cliffhanger or something that hasn't quite been completed to our satisfaction. So here are 4 examples of this. The top left, if you are like many people, there's a sort of uncomfortable feeling when you look at that manhole cover that's been twisted, oriented a little bit, reoriented. The top right, you have this one bar that's shifted down. You just kind of want to reach out and gently nudge it upwards. On the bottom right here, you have this strange square shape that's been tilted diagonal a little bit. And then my favorite one is someone who is a complete sadist and has decided to switch the 2 tiles when they were putting down the different colors. And we are very engaged by this. It turns out that even though it's a low-level frustration, humans hate this. But we hate it in a way that compels us. We are curious about it. It attracts our attention. And until we resolve what is very clearly a very small off-kilter feature, we can't look away. So this is a big part of what drives curiosity, that first cue, that sort of cliffhanger, whether it's visual or story-based, narrative-based. These cliffhangers are all really about stories and visual icons, but a lot of what drives us, what we are curious about in the long run, is social. It's what other people think of us and how they engage with us. So social feedback is a really big part of what makes us hooked for a very long time. And I can show you a good example of this. I'm going to tell you about 2 companies. I'll tell you the name of one of them, and pretty quickly it'll become clear which at least one of these companies is, the name of at least one of them. I'll call them Company A and Company B for the moment, and I'll tell you a few things about them. So they are both in the same market. They both do roughly, similar things. They're founded about 10 months apart. So obviously, if you're going to found 2 companies in the same market, there's an advantage to starting first. So company A has the initial advantage here. Founded in December '09, company B founded in October 10. They both had great marketing, and both basically do the same thing. You take a photo on your phone, you apply a filter, and it makes the photo look more interesting. So one of these is Instagram. Okay, so one of these two is Instagram. I'll tell you what the other one is in a minute. So one of the companies has a great backstory and great marketing. The other one has great marketing. The reason why I say company A has a really great backstory is one of the founders tells a story that turns out not to have been true about finding an old camera from the 1970s in his dad's garage, and he names the company after the camera. So that's company A. There's company B. And then this is actually where they start to diverge. They're both Apple's App of the Year, a year apart. So they're both very successful companies. But here is where the differences emerge. The net worth of company A is today estimated at hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the net worth of company B is tens of billions. You now know which one is Instagram. And the peak user base is 5 million for company A and 1 billion for company B. Company A is Hipstamatic. I don't know how many of you used Hipstamatic. I used it in that roughly 10-month period before Instagram came about. The thing that made Hipstamatic less successful than Instagram, it's a key feature. It is the use of social curiosity, or building social curiosity into the platform. So around the time when Hipstamatic was founded, there was a reporter for the New York Times who took some fantastic photos, and those photos won major competitions. And when the reporter took the photos, he happened to have his iPhone, and he used Hipstamatic. And so Hipstamatic got a lot of great press about how great the photos looked. And so when the founders of the company discussed what they should do, they said, you know what we should do is we should keep finding new filters. We should make this the best camera that possibly could ever exist on the phone. The founders of Instagram had a different conversation. They said, people like taking photos, but they get bored really fast. The way you engage people is you need an engine, something that will drive them to engage for not just 10 minutes or even a year, but for decades, for many decades. And the thing that drives humans more than anything is to know what other people think of them. You will always care what other people think of you, no matter who you are, to different extents. Some people claim they don't, they do. Most of us care a lot about that. It really does matter. It shapes our well-being to a large extent. Now, when you're a child, you can draw a picture of a tree that looks nothing like a tree, and people will tell you you're a tremendous artist. And you get positive feedback really easily. It's part of the way we parent children and how we are with children in general. As an adult, it's much harder to come by that sort of positive feedback. Or at least it was historically. Enter Instagram. Enter Facebook. You can now take a photo of your lunch and people will tell you that you're a terrific human being. It brings you back over and over and over again. That positive feedback is a really powerful driver, and we are curious about it. So what made Instagram so successful was that there was a curiosity engine, a social curiosity engine built into the app. When you take a photo, you don't store it on your phone. It automatically becomes public property, at least as far as your friends are concerned, the people who follow you on Instagram. And that's why we return. That's why a decade after its introduction, we still return to Instagram while there are 1 billion people using the app. Now, there are some other aspects of the world that also rely on this kind of social feedback or social curiosity engine. One of them is the gamification of experiences, turning something that isn't naturally a game into a game. One really good example of this is frequent flyer programs. And it's one of the reasons we engage with them to such an extent. They bring in the elements of something like a video game into a world that doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So we have points. You know from your mileage balance how many miles you've flown. Most of us haven't flown 1 billion miles, but there you have it. This person's been flying for a long time. You can see also that you have these sort of badges, these marks of having made certain achievements or reached certain goals. And so you get badges in the form of status. Silver, gold, bronze, platinum, 1K, and so on for the different airlines. And then here is the most important one from a social perspective. There are also visible leaderboards that compare you to other people. The reason we find this so engaging is because we know where we stand in relation to others. So when you line up to board a plane, especially here's an example with United, you will be in groups. You'll be in group 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And the theory is if you're standing in group 1, you're supposed to look at the people in groups 2 to 5 and say, never again. That's not going to happen to me again. And if you're in group 5, you're supposed to look at the people in groups 1 to 4 and say, one day that'll be me. And this drives a certain kind of engagement. We find this very compelling. And this is a huge part of why we gamify experiences, or why businesses do, because it makes us much more engaged. The curiosity of knowing where we stand in relation to other people makes us much more engaged with the process. The last thing I want to talk about is a sort of social similarity engine, where things that remind you of yourself are much more engaging than things that don't. I'll show you a couple of examples of where this matters. It matters in the way we make a lot of our decisions. We think of ourselves as very lucky. So things that remind us of ourselves we think of as lucky as well. So here are, it's a little hard to see on the back here, I don't know if you can use the side screens, but on the bottom of this graph are the numbers 1 to 49. And this is the commonness of different numbers as chosen by people playing the British lottery, from 1 to 49. The pink bars, pinky purple bars, are 1 to 31, and 32 to 49 are the light bluish bars. So you can see here there's a big difference in the popularity of these. The reason is that when you ask most people how they pick lottery numbers, they say things like, I picked my birthday, or my kid's birthday, or my friend's birthday. It's often tied to things that are very personal. The most personal numbers tend to be birthday numbers. So one rule from this, for those of you who do happen to play the lottery or have ever chosen numbers, is since you have an equal chance of winning with all the numbers, but you have to share your winnings when you make the same choices as everyone else, always pick numbers 32 to 49, because when you win, you won't have to share your winnings with as many people. Just that alone, if one of you win, makes this a valuable exercise. So we like things that remind us of ourselves. This is true in other respects as well. This is one of my favorite academic papers. I'm a psychology and marketing professor. This is a paper about whether dogs look like their owners. And you don't actually need to read the paper, you just need to see some evidence. People pick pets that look like themselves. And they'll swear that's not true, but you can pick them in a lineup. So if you take 100 dogs and 100 owners and you scramble them and you say match the dog to the owner, people are really good at that. That's because dogs and owners look very similar. That's how we pick the things around us in the world. Things that remind us of ourselves are really appealing. And so this matters in some interesting respects for business. I've been talking mainly about engagement in sort of for-profit context, but here's a different context that I think is quite interesting. And I'm going to start with a little demonstration. Here are the letters of the Roman alphabet for the English language. I'd like you to look at the 26 letters, and I'd like you to just spend a second thinking about something you may never have thought of before. I want you to think of your 3 favorite letters. It's a weird thing to be asked to do, but just think about your 3 favorite letters just for a second. Strange thing to have to do. And I want you to put up your hand if at least one of those letters is the first letter of your first name, your middle name, or your last name. Okay, so the vast majority of the audience puts up a hand. We like things that remind us of ourselves, and that comes through in the way we choose what we like. And this matters because we name other things as well. So we're attracted to certain letters, but then when we name other things, we become more or less attracted to them to the extent they remind us of ourselves. Here's a really good example of this. In the United States, the 2005 hurricane season in the Atlantic Basin was very damaging. There were a few very damaging hurricanes. 2 of the most damaging were Katrina and Rita. You can see they had names. They were given names. It just so happened. And there's evidence that people are much more generous in donating to the victims of hurricanes that match their initials, to the tune of 2.5 to even 3.6 times. This means that people who had K names gave 2.5 times more to Katrina relief aid than people without K names, people whose names started with K. The same for Rita, for R. That's been shown true for a lot of different hurricanes. Part of it is you like those names. It's not just that you like them, but they actually capture your attention more effectively. There's a curiosity to them, or to anything that reminds you of who you are, and it draws your attention in. And this is why this matters. I'm just going to make a case for renaming our hurricanes. At the moment, we go down the alphabetical list all around the world. We pick 21 of the 26 letters, and we use names that go down the list from A to B to C to D and so on. Some of the least common initials we don't use, but we use 21 of them. And I don't think that makes sense. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because we don't name ourselves and our children and people generally in the population across an even distribution of the alphabet. This is how we name people. These are the most common and least common initials. So O is much less common in the United States, at least, than J and M. J because a lot of men's names in the US are J named. A lot of women are M named. So you get this divergence. And what this means is some names are going to produce more natural generosity than others. And I can show you for this season in 2018, those are the hurricane names, and this is the extent to which each one will have a boost from matching names. So, I hope none of these does any damage, but if they do, we have to hope that it's Joyce that is damaging and not Oscar, because we are likely to attract far more aid. In fact, I did some simulations with the data. Over a 15-year period, if we named our hurricanes instead of using this sort of random alphabetical list, if we named them using this principle, we could attract an extra $1 billion in aid, just by a simple renaming. That's the power of behavioral science, and also the power of drawing people into things that remind them of themselves. That curiosity really grips them and ultimately makes them much more generous. So the bottom line from all of this is curiosity is a very powerful engine, and it's especially powerful when the economy rests on attention, on grabbing your attention, not just the traditional economy where you buy something, then the producer produces something new, you buy that thing, and they essentially don't care what happens once you take it home. Like, they hope you use it and enjoy it, but whether you use it for a minute a day or an hour a day or 4 hours actually doesn't matter that much. Once you put your money down on the product, it's over. The attention economy requires that you attend to the product for not just minutes or hours, but days across weeks and months and years, and ultimately, if a company is really successful, for many decades. And the way you generate attention, the way you grab attention, to a large extent, based on the research I've done, is through curiosity. Where the producer inspires curiosity, they open up the cliffhanger, they open up a loop, and then it's your job as the producer to close the loop, and that carries on and on and on, to the extent that today, on average, we spend about 4.5 hours every day in front of our screens. And I will leave you there and say thank you very much for spending a bit of time with me, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.